Imagine being trapped behind barbed wire for 16 months, attempting escape more than 20 times, each failure earning you weeks in a pitch-black isolation cell. Imagine memorizing every gauge, every switch, every control surface of an enemy aircraft you have never flown, gambling that this forbidden knowledge might one day mean the difference between freedom and death. Now imagine the chaos of a collapsing empire, the roar of approaching artillery, and a single flyable German fighter sitting unguarded on a cratered airfield. What would you do? This is not fiction. This is not Hollywood exaggeration. This is the true story of Lieutenant Robert Anderson Hoover, an American fighter pilot who did something so audacious, so mathematically improbable, that even 70 years later it defies belief. If you stay with me until the end, you will hear about one of the most extraordinary escapes in the entire history of aviation warfare. Before we begin, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me what city, state, or country you are watching from. Trust me, you will want to remember where you were when you first heard this story. The sky over the Mediterranean Sea on the morning of February 9, 1944, was a hard ceramic blue, the kind of empty brightness that makes distance impossible to judge and every speck on the horizon a potential threat. Lieutenant Robert Hoover, 22 years old, lean and focused, sat cramped in the narrow cockpit of his Supermarine Spitfire Mark V, scanning the vast water below and the hazy coast of southern France ahead. This was his 59th combat mission. 59 times he had climbed into this machine of riveted aluminum and roaring Merlin engine. 59 times he had returned. He was assigned to the 52nd Fighter Group, operating out of Corsica, and his job today was simple in theory, murderous in practice. Sweep the enemy coast, hunt for targets of opportunity, stay alive. The Spitfire was a beautiful aircraft, elliptical wings slicing air with balletic grace, but it was also unforgiving. Fuel capacity was limited. Navigation over open water required constant discipline. Engine temperatures had to be monitored, oil pressure watched, coolant levels balanced. Hoover knew every tremor of his machine, every vibration that signaled trouble. Today, something felt wrong. The engine was running rough, a subtle miss in the rhythm, a hesitation that made him glance repeatedly at his instruments. He was already calculating: fuel remaining, distance to base, time over hostile territory. The numbers were tight. Then the sky exploded. Hoover never saw the German fighter that hit him. One moment he was alone in the blue void, the next his instrument panel shattered in a spray of glass and metal fragments. Cannon shells ripped through the fuselage behind his seat with sounds like hammers striking sheet metal at impossible speed. The Spitfire lurched sideways, controls going slack in his hands. Smoke erupted from the engine cowling, thick and black, pouring back over the canopy. Heat followed, a wave of it, scorching and chemical. The smell of burning oil, burning paint, burning rubber filled his oxygen mask. The altimeter was unwinding, the aircraft falling in a steep descending spiral. Hoover fought the stick, trying to arrest the spin, but the Spitfire would not respond. The controls were dead or severed. The smoke thickened until he could see nothing beyond his shattered windscreen. Flames appeared along the left wing root, bright orange tongues licking back toward the cockpit. He knew what came next. Fuel tanks were just behind the firewall. If those ignited, there would be no bailout, only a fireball and a long plunge into the sea. He jettisoned the canopy. Wind blasted into the cockpit, tearing at his helmet, his goggles, his face. The smoke cleared slightly, and he could see the Mediterranean rushing up, impossibly close, the surface a dark rumpled blue stitched with white caps. He had seconds. He released his harness straps, braced his feet against the rudder pedals, and shoved himself upward and backward out of the dying aircraft. The slipstream caught him like a fist, tumbling him end over end. Sky, water, a sickening rotation. He pulled the ripcord. The parachute canopy cracked open above him with a sound like a gunshot, arresting his fall so violently that his vision grayed at the edges. He hung suspended, swaying beneath the white silk, watching his Spitfire spiral away beneath him and punch into the sea in a geyser of spray and foam. The sound of the impact reached him a heartbeat later, a flat terminal boom. Then silence, broken only by the wind hissing through the parachute shroud lines and the distant, fading drone of aircraft engines. He did not see the German fighter. Perhaps it had already turned for home. Perhaps the pilot thought one kill was enough. Hoover hit the water less than a minute later. The cold was a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. The Mediterranean in February was lethally frigid, somewhere near 50 degrees Fahrenheit. His flight suit and boots soaked through instantly, dragging him down. He thrashed, clawing at the parachute lines tangled around his legs, desperate to avoid being pulled under by the collapsing canopy. His survival vest had a small carbon dioxide inflator for his West life preserver, but his hands were already numb, fingers stiff and clumsy. He found the toggle, yanked it, felt the vest inflate around his chest. It was enough to keep his head above water barely. He floated. The sea was choppy, waves slapping his face, filling his mouth with brine. He could not feel his legs. His teeth chattered so violently he bit his tongue, tasted blood. The cold was not just discomfort, it was a predator, methodical and patient, shutting down his body one system at a time. He tried to swim to generate heat through motion, but his limbs would not obey. Hypothermia was setting in. He knew the stages: shivering, confusion, loss of coordination, unconsciousness, death. He had perhaps an hour, maybe two if he was extraordinarily lucky. The sun moved across the sky. Time became elastic, unreliable. He hallucinated briefly, thought he saw land on the horizon, realized it was only clouds. He prayed, not elaborate prayers, but simple, desperate bargains. Let me live. Let someone find me. He thought about his family in Tennessee, his mother who wrote him letters every week, his father who was so proud when he earned his wings. He thought about the missions he would never fly, the life he would never live. He was 22 years old, and he was dying in the Mediterranean Sea, and no one knew where he was. Then through the ringing cold and encroaching darkness he heard an engine. Not aircraft, something lower, heavier, a diesel throb. He forced his head up, tried to focus. A ship, maybe a mile away, gray and angular against the horizon. He tried to shout, but his voice was a broken croak. He tried to wave, but his arm barely cleared the water. The ship continued on its course, oblivious. He was going to die within sight of rescue. But the ship turned. Someone had seen him, a tiny dark speck in the vast sea. The engine noise grew louder, closer. The vessel was a patrol boat, sleek and predatory, and as it drew near, Hoover could see the markings on its bow. His heart, already struggling against the cold, seemed to stop entirely. The flag was not British, not American. It was the Kriegsmarine ensign, the Nazi naval flag, black swastika centered on white and red. The enemy had found him. Sailors hauled him aboard with boat hooks and rough hands, dragging him onto the deck like a netted fish. He could not stand, could not speak. They stripped off his soaked flight suit, wrapped him in coarse blankets, poured something hot and bitter down his throat. Gradually, painfully, warmth returned. With warmth came the full realization of his situation. He was alive, but he was a prisoner of war. The boat delivered him to a port, he never learned which one. From there, a truck convoy, then a train, the landscape scrolling past the barred windows. French countryside, German villages, forests and fields still locked in winter. Other prisoners joined him, British airmen, American bomber crews, all with the same haunted exhaustion in their eyes. No one spoke much. They were fed thin soup and black bread. The train rattled north for days. Stalag Luft I sat on the Baltic coast near Barth, Germany. a sprawling compound of wooden barracks surrounded by double barbed wire fences, guard towers at each corner, searchlights that swept the grounds all night. It was designed to hold Allied Air Force officers, pilots and navigators and bombardiers, men the Luftwaffe considered fellow warriors deserving of a measure of respect under the Geneva Convention. That respect was conditional and thin. The guards were professional but cold, the commandant a Luftwaffe colonel who ran the camp with bureaucratic precision. Escape attempts were expected, even grudgingly admired, but they were also punished severely. Hoover arrived at Stalag Luft I in late February 1944 and immediately began planning his escape. He was not a man built for passivity. Captivity gnawed at him, a constant psychic weight. He studied the camp routine, the guard rotations, the weaknesses in the wire. Other prisoners warned him. Escape from Stalag Luft I was nearly impossible. The Baltic coast was hostile territory. The local population would turn in escapees for a reward. Recapture meant the cooler, solitary confinement in a windowless concrete cell. He tried anyway. His first attempt was a tunnel dug over weeks with stolen utensils and bare hands, shored up with bed slats. The tunnel collapsed 20 feet from the wire, suffocating one man and injuring 2 others. Hoover spent 2 weeks in solitary. His second attempt was hiding in a refuse cart. A guard probed the cart with a bayonet, missing him by inches, but a dog sniffed him out. 3 weeks in solitary. His third attempt was during a staged diversion, a fight between prisoners that drew the guards away from one section of fence. He made it under the wire, ran 200 yards into the forest, was caught by a patrol with dogs before dawn. 4 weeks in solitary. The cooler was a special kind of torture. A concrete box 6 feet by 8 feet, no light, no heat, no sound except the echo of your own breathing. They fed you once a day, a crust of bread and a cup of water slid through a slot in the steel door. You lost track of time. Hours felt like days. Days felt like weeks. Your mind began to fracture, conjuring shapes in the darkness, voices in the silence. Some men went mad in the cooler. Hoover survived by retreating inward, constructing elaborate mental exercises, replaying every flight he had ever flown, every maneuver, every landing, keeping his mind sharp through sheer discipline. He attempted escape more than 20 times over the next 16 months. Each attempt was different: disguises, forged papers, bribery, distraction, brute force. Each ended in recapture. Each earned him more time in the cooler. The other prisoners began to regard him with a mixture of admiration and concern. Some called him reckless. Some called him insane. But Hoover could not stop. The need to escape was more than strategy. It was physiological, a compulsion as necessary as breathing. Between attempts, he studied. Stalag Luft I held some of the best pilots in the Allied air forces, men who had flown everything from Spitfires to Mustangs to flying fortresses. Some had combat experience against German aircraft, had been shot down after dogfights lasting minutes, had seen the enemy up close. Hoover sought these men out, asked them questions, absorbed every detail they could remember about German fighters. What did the cockpit look like? Where were the critical switches? How did the inertia starter engage? How sensitive were the controls? What were the stall characteristics? He was particularly interested in the Focke-Wulf Fw 190, a radial engine fighter the Luftwaffe had introduced in 1941. It was a brutal, powerful machine, faster than the Spitfire at low altitude, more heavily armed, and flown by some of Germany's best pilots. Several prisoners had detailed knowledge of the 190, either from intelligence briefings or from close examination of captured examples. Hoover memorized everything: the cockpit layout, the instrument panel, the landing gear retraction sequence, the flap settings, the throttle quadrant, the gun sight, the fuel management system. He drew diagrams in the dirt, erased them, drew them again. He rehearsed starting procedures in his mind, imagining the sequence of switches and levers, the sound of the BMW radial engine coughing to life. Other prisoners thought he was preparing for some abstract future contingency. Hoover knew better. He was preparing for an opportunity he could not yet see but believed would come. The winter of 1944 gave way to spring, then summer, then another winter. The war news filtered into the camp through clandestine radios and whispered intelligence from new prisoners. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Paris was liberated. The Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing relentlessly, grinding toward Germany with overwhelming force. The guards at Stalag Luft I grew tense, distracted. Discipline began to fray. By early April 1945, the sound of artillery was audible from the camp, a distant rolling thunder that grew louder each day. The Soviets were close, perhaps 50 miles away. The commandant received orders to evacuate the camp to march the prisoners west, deeper into Germany. But the orders were contradictory, the logistics impossible. The German military infrastructure was collapsing. Roads were clogged with refugees, railways bombed into uselessness. The prisoners sensed the chaos and began to push against the camp rules, testing boundaries, refusing orders. On April 20, 1945, the camp descended into open riot. Prisoners overwhelmed the guards at one gate, tore down sections of fence, flooded into the surrounding forest. The Germans fired warning shots, but their hearts were not in it. Many guards simply walked away, abandoning their posts, heading west toward the imagined safety of American or British lines. In the confusion, Hoover and two other prisoners, both bomber pilots, slipped out through a collapsed section of wire and disappeared into the woods. They traveled west, parallel to the coast, avoiding roads and towns. The countryside was surreal, empty of military presence but filled with civilian chaos. Farmhouses burned. Refugees streamed past carrying suitcases and bundled belongings. In one village, they found a German woman, elderly and defiant, who fed them boiled potatoes and gave them a Luger pistol with a half-empty magazine. She asked no questions, demanded no explanations, simply looked at them with eyes that had seen too much and said in broken English, "Go, before the Russians come." They walked for 2 days, sleeping in barns, drinking from streams, moving only at dawn and dusk. On the second day, they spotted an airfield, or what remained of one. It was a small Luftwaffe base, heavily bombed, cratered runways and collapsed hangars. Most of the aircraft were wrecks, burned-out hulks with wings torn off and fuselages split open. But at the far end of the field, partially hidden under camouflage netting, sat a single fighter. Even from a distance, Hoover recognized the silhouette. A Focke-Wulf Fw 190, angular and predatory, its radial engine cowling like a shark's snout. His companions thought he was joking when he said he was going to fly it out. They thought he was suffering from exhaustion, from the stress of the escape. But Hoover was calm, methodical. He had been preparing for this moment for 16 months. He knew the layout of that cockpit better than he knew the cockpit of his own Spitfire. This was the contingency he had trained for in his mind through all those hours in the cooler, all those nights lying awake in the barracks, imagining impossible escapes. They approached the airfield at dusk, creeping through the rubble and shell craters. The base was not entirely abandoned. A few mechanics were still there, moving among the wrecks, salvaging parts, preparing to evacuate. Hoover watched them for an hour, studying their movements. Finally, he stood up, walked into the open, the Luger in his hand, and in his best approximation of command authority shouted in broken German for everyone to stop. The mechanics froze. They were old men, teenagers, re-echelon personnel who had never expected to face enemy soldiers on their own airfield. Hoover pointed at the Focke-Wulf and using gestures and single words made his demand clear. "Start the engine." The mechanics stared at him. One, a gray-haired man with oil-stained coveralls, began to argue, shaking his head, pointing at the aircraft as if to say it was not airworthy, it had not been flown in weeks. It was impossible. Hoover cocked the Luger. His hand was steady. The mechanic stopped arguing. The Focke-Wulf's engine was a BMW 801, a 14-cylinder radial that required an inertia starter, a hand-cranked flywheel that spun up to high speed and then engaged the engine through a clutch. The mechanic and another young assistant retrieved the starter handle, inserted it into the port on the fuselage side, and began cranking. The flywheel whined, rising in pitch, a sound like a giant insect. When it reached maximum speed, the mechanic pulled a lever. The engine coughed, backfired, coughed again, and roared to life in a cascade of blue smoke and noise. The sound was immense, visceral, the BMW radial hammering out 1,800 horsepower in a deep staccato bellow. The aircraft shuddered on its landing gear, propeller blades cutting the air into a visible disc. Hoover climbed onto the wing, pulled himself into the cockpit. The seat was designed for a pilot wearing a parachute. He had none, so he sat too low, barely able to see over the instrument panel. The controls were labeled in German: Fahrwerk for landing gear, Landeklappen for flaps, Gemisch for mixture. He had memorized these words months ago. He did not wave goodbye to his companions. There was no room for sentiment, no room for hesitation. He advanced the throttle, felt the aircraft lurch forward, the tail wheel lifting as speed built. The runway was cratered, littered with debris. He zigzagged between the worst of the damage, picking up speed, 50 kilometers per hour, 80-100. The controls were heavy, unresponsive at low speed, then suddenly alive. The 190 leapt off the ground, climbing steeply, the engine roaring. He retracted the landing gear, felt the clunk of the wheels locking into the wings, and turned west. He was flying a German fighter, marked with black crosses and swastikas, over German territory, heading toward Allied lines. Any Allied pilot who saw him would shoot him down without hesitation. Any German anti-aircraft battery that had ammunition left would fire on anything in the sky, friend or foe. He had no radio, no parachute, no maps. His fuel gauge showed half full, maybe 300 kilometers of range if he was lucky. He had to navigate by the sun and terrain, had to stay low to avoid radar, had to hope the Allied pilots were too busy or too exhausted to chase a lone German fighter fleeing west. The landscape below was a nightmare. Towns burning, columns of refugees, abandoned military vehicles. He followed roads when he could, used rivers and rail lines for navigation. The engine ran rough at first, coughing and missing, then smoothed out as it warmed. The cockpit smelled of oil and cordite and old leather. The stick was stiffer than a Spitfire's, the controls less forgiving, but the 190 was fast, brutally fast, and it had reserves of power he could feel waiting in the throttle quadrant. He crossed into what he believed was the Netherlands within an hour, the landscape flattening into canals and polders. The fuel gauge was dropping toward empty. He had to land soon or risk flaming out and crashing. He spotted a field, relatively flat, no obvious obstacles, and began a descending turn. The 190 slowed reluctantly, the engine rumbling as he reduced power. He extended the flaps, felt the aircraft decelerate, nose rising. The ground rushed up. He flared, held the stick back, felt the tail wheel touch first, then the main gear, a jolt that rattled his teeth. The aircraft rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust. Silence, the engine ticked as it cooled. Hoover sat in the cockpit, hands shaking, unable to move. He had done it. He had stolen a German fighter and flown it to freedom. It was impossible, and he had done it. Then he heard shouting. He looked up, saw figures running toward the aircraft from a nearby farmhouse, men with pitchforks and axes, faces twisted with rage. They thought he was German, a Luftwaffe pilot making an emergency landing. He kicked open the canopy, stood up on the seat, raised his hands, and shouted in English, "American, I am American." The men did not stop. He shouted again, louder, desperate, "I am a prisoner of war. I escaped. I am American." One man, younger than the others, stopped running, held up a hand. The others slowed, suspicious, weapons raised. Hoover climbed down from the wing, hands still raised. He was wearing a filthy, torn Luftwaffe flight suit he had found in the aircraft, but his face was gaunt, his hair too long, his eyes exhausted. The young Dutchman stepped closer, said something in Dutch. Hoover shook his head, repeated, "American, prisoner of war, escaped." The young man's expression changed, suspicion giving way to astonishment. He turned to the others, spoke rapidly in Dutch, then turned back to Hoover and said in careful English, "You steal this airplane." Hoover nodded. The Dutchman began to laugh, a sound of pure disbelief and joy. The others lowered their weapons, crowded around, touching the aircraft, touching Hoover as if to confirm he was real. British soldiers arrived within the hour, a patrol from the advancing Second Army. They were as skeptical as the civilians had been, but Hoover's dog tags, his service number, his detailed knowledge of the 52nd Fighter Group convinced them. They drove him to a field headquarters, fed him, debriefed him, stared at him as if he were a ghost. The intelligence officers wanted to know everything about Stalag Luft I, about the German airfield, about the Focke-Wulf. Hoover answered their questions mechanically, his mind still processing what he had done. The war in Europe ended 18 days later on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The camps were liberated. The prisoners came home. Hoover returned to the United States, to Tennessee, to his family, to a world that had moved on without him. He did not speak much about his escape, not for years. It felt too strange, too improbable, too much like a tall tale. But the story was true. Every word of it, verified by military records, by the testimonies of other prisoners, by the Dutch civilians who witnessed his landing, by the British soldiers who recovered the Focke-Wulf. Hoover had stolen an enemy fighter, flown it across hostile territory, and landed it safely behind Allied lines, a feat of airmanship and audacity unmatched in the history of the war. After the war, Hoover became a test pilot, one of the greatest in American history. He flew the first jet aircraft, pushed experimental planes to their limits, mentored a generation of pilots. He became a legendary airshow performer, known for routines that defied physics and common sense, maneuvers so precise and dangerous that other pilots refused to attempt them. He flew until his 80s, still sharp, still fearless. He died in October 2016 at the age of 94, his mind clear, his memory intact, his legacy secure. What Robert Hoover proved that day in April 1945 was something deeper than skill, something beyond courage. He proved that knowledge, preparation, and absolute refusal to accept defeat could overcome impossible odds. He proved that a man with nothing but a stolen aircraft and a half-tank of fuel could choose freedom over captivity, could gamble everything on a single desperate act and win. He proved that even in the darkest moments of history, when empires crumble and nations burn, individual human will can still shape outcomes, can still write its own story against the crushing weight of circumstance. His escape remains one of the most extraordinary acts of the entire Second World War, a moment when training, memory, and sheer audacity converged into something that should not have been possible but was. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, retold, and honored. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what courage really means, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. I want to hear from you in the comments. If you were in Hoover's position, would you have taken that aircraft, knowing you might be shot down by your own side? What would you have done differently? And tell me where you are watching from. What city, what state, what country? Stories like this connect us across time and distance, reminding us what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. Thank you for staying until the end. You now know one of the most incredible escapes in aviation history, a story that will stay with you long after these words fade.